Mr. Tanner has most recently co-edited Replacing Obamacare, the Cato Institute on Healthcare Reform, and he also publishes in nearly every major American newspaper, including the New York Times, Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, and USA Today. So, Mr. Tanner, welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and it looks like I just got the hardcore wonks in here, the people who really want to do the deep dive on this stuff. I should tell you that I know that some of what I'm talking about today is going to be the same thing that Dan Mitchell talked about yesterday, but I warn you that Dan Mitchell is an incurable optimist by comparison. I won't let any of his Pollyanna pronouncements about how good everything is going to be in the future get into this talk at all. So I'm guaranteed to do my best to really depress you or anger you or something along those lines. I want to talk to you today a little bit about the welfare state as a pyramid scheme in essence. We all know what a pyramid scheme is like. In the United States, we're talking about a Ponzi scheme after one of the most famous examples of a pyramid scheme. But a pyramid scheme essentially works where a person at the top of the pyramid collects money from the people down below it. He does pretty well because he's collecting all money from everyone down below. And probably the next group of people, they collect from the group down below them. And they do all right, and then the next group, they collect from the bottom up. But eventually, you can't get enough people to keep collecting money from, and the whole scheme sort of collapses. If you want to go back and look at the most famous scheme in the United States, the Ponzi scheme, Charles Ponzi came up with this, and he actually, I have to tell you, actually originally had a fairly good business idea. He was going to make money at the time on the float between postage rates in different countries. He had this idea that at the time they sold stamps in one country that were good in another country, and you could buy them at different rates, and his idea was that if you could buy stamps cheap in country A, move them to country B where they were more expensive, you could make money on that. The problem was, even back then, government postal systems were so inefficient that he couldn't actually buy the stamps and move them in time to take advantage of the difference in prices. So he gave up on that, and he came up with this idea where he said basically, okay, what I'll do is I'll tell everyone I'm making this investment, but I won't actually do it. So he would collect money from people, tell them he was investing in this postage scheme, and then he would keep the money. And he went out and he got another group of people, he took money from them, and he gave that back to the first people who had given him money, and he said, look, I've doubled your money in 6 months. Go and tell everybody what a wonderful investment this is, in which they went out and they did it, and he did this for a while, but eventually he can't get money in fast enough. He just can't find enough people to go out and do this, and the whole scheme ultimately collapsed, and he went to jail for a while, and then he later on became the head of Italian Airlines under Mussolini. But this is the classic way that a Ponzi scheme works. Now, a lot of people talk about various government programs as being a Ponzi scheme or a pyramid scheme. And in many ways, I'm going to show you they really do resemble one. But there's one key difference. Charles Ponzi didn't have a gun. The fact is that ultimately his scheme broke down because he couldn't force people to keep giving him money. The big difference with government programs is they can. And ultimately, they can just make you give money even when the whole thing is falling apart. So we should keep that sort of thing, that sort of difference in mind here as we move forward with this. Anyway, I want to give you a little bit of talk about just how bad off things are. This is budget deficits that countries are running right now. A budget deficit is just how much more the country spends this year than it takes in taxes. It brings in $100, spends 200 euro, then you've got a problem. And you can see, the usual suspects are running problems there. This is the percentage of GDP. Greece is obviously in the worst shape. Spain is pretty bad. Ireland, Portugal. Most of these countries are running GDP in excess of 5 or 6%. of the GDP in terms of the budget deficits, which is pretty bad, but you can get away with this from time to time. You know, you think of this as your own budget. You know, sometimes you spend more money than you have. You know, that's what credit cards are for. So you go out and you spend a little bit more money than you have, and if you do that once in a while, it's not the end of the world. The problem is if you do that week after week after week after week, pretty soon those credit card bills are going to get up there and they're going to be pretty bad. And in fact, that's when you start getting national debt. If the budget deficit is how profligate a country is in 1 year, then the national debt is how profligate they are as you add them up overall. And this is looking at budget the debt in a country as a percentage of GDP. And you can see, you know, once again, Greece is the worst, where their debt is 150% of their country's GDP. That's more than 1.5 times the value of all the goods and services that are produced in that country over the course of a year. Think of it again as if your credit card debt now was 1.5 times your annual salary. You'd clearly have a problem. And you can see other countries that are running greater than their GDP, 100% of their GDP, are Italy, Portugal, Ireland, Belgium, and the United States. Yeah, we're right up there with those guys. So 105% of our GDP in the United States that we currently owe as our national debt. Now, when you owe more than all your resources put together, that is probably a big problem. Unfortunately, that's actually the good news. As bad as all those numbers look, that is really the good news. And that's because when it comes to debt, governments actually have several types of debt. They have publicly held debt. This is the debt that when the government goes out and it sells a bond, all those Greek bonds that the German banks hold, that's publicly held debt. It could be debt that people hold in their portfolios. People often own government bonds. Retirement funds and pension funds, banks often own government bonds. That's publicly held debt. It's debt that a country issues and they go out and they sell that debt to the public and someone buys it. Now, economists will generally say this is the worst kind of debt to have for a couple of reasons. One reason is you actually have to pay it back at some point because someone actually holds that debt and you're going to have to give them, you know, they have a bond and at some point that bond becomes due, it matures, you actually have to pay them. You actually have to pay interest on this debt too. And in many cases, the interest that some countries are having to pay in order to get people to buy their debt is really high, 7–8% or more. And third, this is the type of debt that actually crowds out private debt because there's only so much money available, and if government's going to borrow it, that means private companies can't borrow that money to go out and if they want to expand their business or hire new people or whatever, so it's supposed to squeeze out debt on the private side. So for a lot of reasons, publicly held debt is the thing people worry about the most. But there's these other kinds of debt as well. One is intergovernmental debt. This is more or less an American phenomenon. Most other countries that I know of don't have a lot of this. But this is debt that one part of the government owes to itself. In the United States, the Social Security Trust Fund or the Medicare Trust Fund are examples of this type of debt, where essentially one part of the government issues a bond to another part of the government and they sort of borrow the money back and forth. This is also real debt because ultimately those bonds become due and they have to pay it back, and it theoretically earns the rate of interest and all the rest. But because it's the government owing other parts of the government, sort of like your left pocket owing your right pocket, it doesn't really change wealth overall, and you can play more games with it, frankly. They can take their time paying it back. They can do some other things in terms of rolling it over. So it's not quite as serious, and they're not competing with the private sector debt in the same way that with debt held by the public is. Third type of debt is the one that I think is one you really need to pay attention to, and this is implicit debt. This is the unfunded obligations of things like health care and pension systems. And this is the debt when you look at a country's pension system, their public pension system, for example. It's fairly easy to calculate in the future how much they're going to owe. You can know how many people are going to be retired in a given year. You know how much the benefits are for those people. You can figure out how much the country's going to have to pay in future Social Security benefits or pension benefits, let's say in 2020 or 2030. You have a pretty good idea what they're going to have to pay. You also can figure out roughly how much the system's going to bring in tax revenue. You know what the taxes are, you know what how many people are working, what the tax rate is, and you can calculate roughly how much is going to come in. And generally, there's a gap between the two. You've got this amount coming in, this amount you're going to have to pay out. There's a gap in between the two. That's the unfunded liabilities of the system. That's a debt, because unless you change the law, you're ultimately going to have to come up with the money to pay those benefits. So even though there's not something written down on paper like there is with the other types of debt, that is still the debt that's going to apply that ultimately is going to have to be paid off. When those benefits come due, if you don't have enough tax revenue, you're going to have to go out and find that money somewhere. Or the government's going to have to go out and find that money somewhere, which generally means they're going to have to come to you in order to find it. So if you want to add all those types of debt together, this is what you actually get in terms of the debt obligations that various countries are facing. Once again, we got Greece, which is facing 875% of their GDP. They owe almost 9 times more than what they produce over the course of a year in all goods and services. Next up, you have the United States. We get to be number 2, but we're trying hard. We owe about 800% of GDP. Then you get down to France, the Netherlands, Portugal, all around 500% of GDP, and you begin to move all the way down. Spain's actually in one of the best situations there. It's only about 250% of GDP they owe with their total debt. For all we hear about the pigs and we hear about how bad things are in Spain, it's much more of a short-term problem than it is long-term obligations. But in the long term, you can see in some countries that are in really, really bad shape when it comes to this. A lot of you are familiar with the Laffer Curve. We talk a lot about this. You know, Dan Mitchell talked about it yesterday. This is the idea that once you get to a certain point of taxation, you begin to get less revenue, and this is certainly going to be a problem because if you try to raise enough taxes to pay all that debt, you're going to run up into you're going to certainly tip over onto the far side of that Laffer Curve. In fact, you're already having tax burdens that are unusually high. This is combined tax burdens. Can't see the bottom of the chart here. Got cut off. But you're dealing with these. Most of the EU countries are dealing with about a 35 or 40% tax rate. Very clearly near the top of that Laffer Curve. You can't continue to raise taxes in order to pay off that debt obligation that you were facing. So I like to look at this yet another way, though, because it's not just the amount of taxes that you're paying. It's not just the amount of debt you hold, because they're really not any different. Milton Friedman used to say that the real cost of government has nothing to do with whether you borrow a lot of money or you tax a lot. The real cost of government is how much you spend. Because whether you tax that money or you borrow that money, ultimately you're taking that money out of the productive uses of society and you're having the government spend it. So what really matters is not so much the combination. Yes, there's distributional effects, but what really matters is not the combination of taxes and borrowing. It's how much the government spends. And ultimately, the size of government itself is what's really important when you start talking about the burden that you face from government. Robert Barrow, who's at Harvard University, says there's a significant negative relationship between the growth of real GDP and the growth of the government share of GDP. In other words, very simply, as government gets bigger, GDP growth slows. And there's been a number of studies that show this, and they argue about what is the optimal size of government. But at some point, what you get is as government starts to get bigger, your GDP growth begins to slow. This is another study. This was from the U.S. Congress's Joint Economic Committee. It says as government moves beyond the core functions of protecting people and property, they will adversely affect economic growth because of disincentive effects of higher taxes and crowding out of public investment, whether you're taxing or borrowing. Diminishing returns as government undertake activities which they are ill-suited. In other words, the government basically does things that it doesn't know how to do, like run a healthcare system or and so on, welfare state. Interference with wealth creation process, as the government's not good as markets at determining where the money should be invested. So for all of these reasons is why that GDP growth slows. Richard Rahn, who was the former head of the U.S. Chief Economist for the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, created what then was called, you've heard of the Laffer Curve, he calls it the Ron Curve, not surprisingly, or it's been named after him as the Ron Curve. And this basically talks about exactly what happens as government grows. Initially, you see some growth in GDP as government begins to make expenditures. And this is largely for things like court systems, a national defense. Your night watchman state here, for all you minarchists, this is as you begin to invest in those small things, having some place to adjudicate disputes and so on, it does seem to increase GDP. But once you get beyond those core functions, what you see as government begins to spend, GDP growth begins to go down. And you begin to have not just diminishing returns, but an actual decline in GDP growth from the size of government. Well, this is the size of government. This is government expenditures as a percent of GDP in most in countries. You can see France leads the way, up about 55% of GDP is spent by government in France. Greece is over 50% as well, Italy as well, and then you begin to move down. But in all these EU countries, you're over 40% of GDP being spent by government. Clearly, when you're over that rate, you can, the studies argue about what rate you hit the top of that Ron curve. Believe me, you're over the top of that Ron curve and you're on your way down. So economic growth is slowing as a result of the size of government. That means that all of you are going to be less rich than you otherwise would be. Regardless of how much they're going to tax you in the future, or whether they're going to squeeze out your borrowing and raise your interest rates and all of those sorts of things, which means you have less. You're also going to have less because your economies are growing slower than they otherwise would. That means you're going to have lower wages, you're going to have less opportunities for jobs, all of those things that are falling on you because the way the government is growing. And where is that going to? Basically, that money's going to the welfare state. We talk a lot about things government does, and there's an argument to be made. I don't necessarily buy it, but there's an argument to be made. The Keynesians will make it, and others says, well, government investment can make you richer. If the government goes in and spends money on something that's going to generate more economic growth, then they'll be richer in the future, and then it's all a wash. That's why the Keynesians argue in favor of government stimulus. The problem is that most government expenditures aren't any sort of investment. They're not, there's an argument to be made that says, okay, they build a road, the road enables more commerce, therefore there'll be more economic activity, and in the future everybody will be a little bit richer because they built that road. I'm sort of the Bastiat school that says, okay, you see the road built, you don't see all the stuff that didn't get built because they took the taxes to build that road, but grant them that argument that maybe a road generates some economic growth. Most of what government is spending has nothing to do with building a road, or a court system to adjudicate disputes, or a defense to keep people from invading your country, or anything like that. Most of what government spends is simply a transfer payment where they take from you and they give to you. That doesn't generate anything. And if you look at the welfare state in these countries as an expenditure, this is basically looking at current government outlays are in the blue, and you can see that between 40 and 50% basically of government outlays are going to the welfare state right now. So we're not talking about education, we're not talking about, we're basically talking about pure transfers, pure support systems in the welfare state, pensions, unemployment insurance, cash transfers for low-income people, things of that nature. And you then look at what's going to happen by 2050, and you can see in every country that's going to get bigger. So you're going to squeeze out, there's going to be less money available. Let's look at this as a percentage of GDP. You're seeing the welfare state itself is going to be, let alone expenditures for anything else, the welfare state is going to be in the 25 to 30% range of GDP in the future. What you basically are going to do is squeeze out everything else. There will be no money for education. There will be no money to build roads and bridges. There will be no money for national defense. What there will be is transfer payments from you to you. And that's all that will be available. You squeeze out everything else. Now, You know, I often have a dream many a night in which all these other government functions go away, but I don't necessarily dream it so that we can give more money primarily to old people in their retirement. That's what most of that growth is. I might think that the government doesn't have much of business running an education system, but the idea that we're going to do away with the education system so that we can spend more money on pensions for senior citizens doesn't strike me as being the way we actually want to go. That's not doing anything to leave more money in your pockets. That's simply giving more money to people who are retired. Well, what about austerity? You know, I've told you all these terrible things that have been going on, but, you know, you guys just lived through the age of austerity, right? I mean, even President Obama just says we've had terrible austerity in the United States. You know, Paul Krugman, you know, writes a newspaper column, I think it's about every other day, talking about how terrible austerity's been for Europe. As he says, austerity represents a stunning failure of policy. And he talks, I mean, I was amazed. I flew in here today, and there was actually people on the street. You know, I thought, that, I expected a wilderness, dogs running amidst the bodies, laying in the street. The people starving, and something that looked like it was out of the 18th century, because Paul Krugman's told me that austerity and that nothing's been going on in here and all that. To which I ask one question. What austerity? This is government spending in a number of countries here that's been going on since 2001 until the last numbers we had were 2012. Anybody want to look at that and show me where the austerity is? Where's the massive reductions in government spending there? Every one of those countries, every country in 2012, this is all in real dollars, inflation adjusted. In every one of those countries, they're spending more money in 2012 than they were spending in 2001. So, it's hard to say. Greece, okay, Greece has been sort of flat. France, well, what can we say about France? That hasn't been said by most of the other speakers up here. But, UK, there's one. Britain, they've been in the grips of austerity, right? You've had real tough austerity measures in Britain. Well, maybe not. Paul Krugman might have missed something. I mean, heaven forbid. I mean, it's hard for me to argue with him, but he might actually have missed something there. Look. Back to the idea of what's happening. The folks at the top of the pyramid are doing okay. That's the people who are getting pensions today. That's the people who are getting benefits of the welfare state today, whether it's pensions, welfare payments, free health care, whatever it might be. They're doing okay. The problem is down here at the bottom of that pyramid. And that's you at the bottom of the pyramid. Because you are being robbed. You are ones who are ultimately going to have to pay for all those people at the top of the pyramid. You're going to pay in taxes. You're going to pay in debt, which is going to come back to you in the form of taxes you'll have to pay in the future. All debt is basically deferred taxes. It's taxes that aren't being paid today, it's being paid in the future. So when you see those 400% or 500% of GDP numbers, that just means you're going to have to pay these numbers. I think Dan showed yesterday it was about 10% of GDP, 8 to 10% of GDP every year in additional taxes in order to service the debt. That's additional taxes you will ultimately have to pay. But more than that, you are paying right now, not just taxes you will have to pay in the future, not just taxes you're paying now, but you're also paying right now because your economies are growing more slowly in order to pay for the welfare state. Your jobs are paying you less than they would otherwise pay. Your salaries are less than they otherwise would. Your chances of getting a job are less than they otherwise would be. Your opportunities are fewer than they otherwise would be. In the United States, the most famous pyramid scheme after Charles Ponzi was run by Bernie Madoff. He went to jail. And frankly, your political leaders today, if they were doing what they're doing in the private sector, they would be going to jail. because they are stealing from you. Your generation is basically getting screwed by the welfare state. It'll come crashing down before you see the benefits. When you retire, you're not going to get those generous pensions that they're handing out today. In some cases, pensions that are more than people earned when they were working. And I understand why. Because in most countries, old people vote, and you don't. You know, I was in a conference, not so very long ago, down in the Balkans. And an economics minister came up to me, and he was explaining that they had a replacement rate for their pension system, their public pension system, of 120% of pre-retirement income. That means after someone retired, they actually earned more money than when they were working. And I said to him, I said, how could you get yourself into this situation? And he said, you have to understand, we have a lot of elections. So the politicians always went out and promised higher pensions to the seniors who would vote, and they didn't care that they were going to make you guys pay more later on because you guys didn't vote. So my plea is not one about voting, but one about activism. Yes, I do think it matters that young people should vote because otherwise they don't care. But whatever you do, whether it's voting or protesting or running a think tank or running a political party or whatever it might be, if you don't get active, then you are acquiescing in what's happening to you. Because one last time, they are stealing from you. And it's up to you to stop them. Thank you very much. I appreciate your listening to me.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tanner, for a very interesting speech. Do you have any questions or comments or remarks? Yes, please.
Yeah, Tim Dyer from the United Kingdom. The question I have is, as you noted, pensioners are more likely to vote than young people. So politicians will always be swayed by pensioners rather than young people, and therefore they'll continue to get larger and larger pensions. But one of the problems that I've come across when you try and have that discussion with anyone who's nearing retirement or who is a pensioner, they genuinely feel that they earned their pension. They feel that they deserve their pension. They worked their whole life, they paid tax, they paid national insurance contributions. Whereas the reality is, if they had actually earned that pension, it would have been provided for, there would be a big fund of money, and we wouldn't need to tax anyone today. So how can we address that, and how can we challenge pensioners on that point that they haven't earned it and don't deserve it?
Yeah, I think that's a big problem, because they were very good with language. They convinced people that when they pay their pension tax or whatever it might be, payroll taxes, that somehow has something to do with their retirement. That in the United States, people actually sit there and think there's a little account with their name on it. When you pay your taxes, that's where it goes. The reality is that pension systems are nothing more than a transfer system from workers to retirees. They take money from people who are working and give it to people who are retired. There's no savings, there's no investment, there's nothing that goes into individuals where they paid in and they kept it. It's just like any other tax. But they've really convinced seniors that that they paid for it, and they should get it back. I think politically, that makes it very hard to simply cut pensions. And I think politicians who simply talk about, well, we're going to cut pensions back, in many cases they may have no choice. If you're in Greece and you're facing that kind of debt, you're going to have to cut pensions. That's when you get a lot of problems politically. I think what you need to do is begin to transition people in the middle away from this idea of a certain guaranteed level of pension. And that's going to be people largely in their 30s and 40s who may have contributed something into the system already, are probably willing to understand they're not going to get it all back, and are willing to make some of those changes. Is that going to really save everything that you guys are going to have to pay? No. In many ways, we sort of run up the credit cards. And let's face it, if you run up your credit card, you're stuck. You're going to have to pay it. But for God's sake, stop charging. And the longer you keep doing it, the more people you keep getting into that situation, the worse it's going to be. When today's 30-year-olds get to be 60 and they start to retire, they're going to say, don't take away my pension. So you're going to have to start transitioning them out now. And basically, I think, beginning to shave back their future benefits where there's lots of time for them to adjust, while also changing their contributions to some sort of personal private savings system of some kind, whether it's personal, what's the second pillar or third pillar within the system, so you have private savings either inside or outside the government. But something along those lines is what you need to begin doing gradually in order to change the system for the future.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question, gentleman in front.
Excuse me.
Hello, I'm Martin from the Czech Republic. You campaign for the change the world over. So I would like to ask you if you find some arguments more convincing than others. Is it like for example, if you tell the people that the return on their investment sort of is negative, or what is the argument that kind of persuades the people that they start to think that it probably is not as efficient as they think?
Sure, I think two different groups have two different arguments. I think for young people, it's basically how bad off you are. And they understand the demographics of it, and they understand, very few young people I've found in any country believe that pensions are going to be there for them the way they are for today's retirees. Almost everywhere I've gone, they understand that by the time they're retired, their pensions are going to be cut. If not gone away completely, they're at least going to be a lot less than people who retire today. And I actually don't think it's tough to organize young people behind this. But as I've been mentioned earlier, young people don't necessarily have the political power. Governments, finance ministers, actually, what they're attracted to has nothing to do with fairness or rates of return on young people, all that. It has to do with increasing national savings. And the fact that right now, when you just have a transfer, there's no savings taking place, no investment taking place, where if you move to a system of some sort of personal accounts or whatever, where money is actually invested in something, it increases the national savings rate, and they see this as a way of increasing economic growth. This is what moved a lot of the countries in the former Soviet bloc, to move to private pension systems originally. That was one of the things that increased their possibility. They also had an advantage of the fact that nobody believed in any of the promises that had been made under the old Soviet system, and it was much easier to cut seniors' benefits when nobody believed in them. It's much tougher in the West politically for that regard.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions?
Yes, thank you. My name is Franz from Germany, and I'm basically agreeing with you, but I think you didn't talk about one big difference. Mr. Ponzi and Mr. Madoff and all the guys who ran a pyramid scheme, they didn't have a printing press in their backyard. So for now, all the European and as well as the US government and the Chinese government is getting started on that as well. They keep on running and running by just printing new money. I mean, they disguise it very nicely, but basically they are able to go even lower with when you look at the picture that you have up there, they make more people winners than they make people losers. So what do you think how long they can keep it going? And maybe because right now they seem pretty successful with it. I don't agree with what they do, but they keep it going. So what do you think how long they can keep up with that, and when will tumble down?
Well, right now they seem to be reasonably successful with it. I mean, interest rates are very low, which enables them to get away with a lot of borrowing, a lot of printing of money, primarily, and the interest rates are low for a lot of sort of macroeconomic reasons. I mean, there's slack in the labor markets and so on coming out of the recession and things of this nature that allows them to do a lot more printing would otherwise exist. We're not going to have low interest rates forever. Historically, the interest rates right now they're around 1.5% in the U.S. Historically, they've been around 5% for government borrowing. If it starts to go up, the interest payments you have to make on this debt begins to become much more extreme. Or else you could simply try to print your way out of it, in which case inflation begins to rise. We haven't seen that yet, although in commodities you're beginning to see some inflation. So we need to be on the watch for that, whether or not that's going to come back large scale. Ultimately, you can only do it for so long. You end up being Zimbabwe or the Weimar Republic or whatever. You start pushing them on, bills around in a shopping cart because they're essentially worthless. You can't make it go forever. When does it fall apart? That's tough. I mean, there isn't a given day. It's, at some point, the bond markets, I think, wake up and look at all this debt that's out there and say, wait a minute, they're never going to be able to pay this back, in which case then you have a huge problem. I will say one of the things that's in the United States that's worrying me, we give about 40% of our debt to foreigners, to foreign countries. About the largest single bearer right now of US debt is the Chinese. They have recently begun moving from 30-year notes to 10-year notes, which seems to suggest to me that they have some concerns about long-term viability of the debt. If that's the case, it's going to become harder and harder to get people to buy that debt, in which case interest rates are going to rise. And then, if you can look at some of the countries, Germany can still borrow very reasonably. But what are Italian bonds going for right now? About 7%, I think, what they're asking, somewhere around there, 6-7%. That's a tough interest rate to have to pay.
Okay, any other questions? If it's not, then thank you, Mr.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Just a moment, please. Now, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to give you a certificate of appreciation for being an honorary speaker at the European SonsofLibertas conference. So, thank you for being here with us.
Thank you. Appreciate it.